So welcome to the final session, Articulating the Elements of a Model National Laboratory System. My name is Joanne Andriadis. I'm the Associate Director for Science in the Office of Readiness and Response at CDC. Now, over the last 2 days, we've heard a couple of important themes. The need for a playbook with triggers and rules of engagement that sets expectations and clearly defines partners' roles and responsibilities. The importance of de-risking the partner ecosystem by addressing barriers like regulation, reimbursement structures, logistics, and more, and promoting predictability, which really applies across the board to all partners. We also talked about ensuring interoperability and flexibility across the system to ensure that partners can respond to a range of threats and conditions. And in this context, we talked about minimal data sets, administrative readiness, and more. And part of this is also about buying down risk. And that means, like in this context, focusing on things like early warning to give us that extra time up front to do other things that we need to do. Another piece was remembering to leverage the unique assets we have aside from testing. Each partner in this ecosystem brings many other capabilities and assets to the tables that could be leveraged. So as an example, in the pharmacy discussion, one of the things we talked about was the ability to use pharmacies to tap directly into testing in communities, thousands of communities, almost immediately. Academic partners also provide many capabilities. One that really wasn't mentioned as much as I think it could have been is actually research to assist with characterization of a new threat, of leveraging basic infrastructure for basic science and applied science to help us understand what we're looking at, what the risks are to the public's health, and how quickly we need to respond and at what scale. And lastly, I think another important point that was made earlier today is around what Tom Frieden used to call winnable battles. And that is also, I think, was eloquently stated earlier, but what do we already have that we can immediately build on and make progress on, where we don't have to start from scratch? Let's go there and let's start there. So in this last panel, we wanted to envision how we can take what we've heard previously and think in a very bold way about what a national system might look like. And we've invited a number of thought leaders from different fields to help us to do that. And so let me take a minute now to introduce our speakers. So we're joined today by Jill Taylor, who's a Senior Advisor for Scientific Affairs with the Association of Public Health Laboratories. We're also joined by Jamie Yassif, Vice President of Global Biological Policy and Programs at NTI. Chris Hassel is the Deputy Assistant Secretary and a Senior Science Advisor within the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. And Jonathan Genzen, who is the Chief Medical Officer of ARIP. So we wanted to ask our panelists to start by sharing 2 to 3 core features of a model laboratory system. And Jill, can you help start us off, please?
There we go. So I am much more energetic than I was yesterday. I was depressed yesterday because we were going through all the problems. Today is a much more positive, forward-thinking, lean-in day, and so that's really exciting. And what I'm going to talk about really is, I think I know where I want to get to, but getting to that point is difficult because it's so complex to think about a national laboratory system. So I'm going to talk about the first steps of how we might set that up and get there. So I think we can start with the fact that our remit in this workshop is to focus on how we achieve a national system that ensures that all populations are equitably served with testing in an emergency. Now, every emergency is going to be different, so anything that we set up has to be flexible and have a lot of moving parts that overlap, if you like, in different ways, depending on the sort of emergency. I think we've also been reassured's not the right word, but emphasised, if you like, yesterday and today by the fact that we have a system of very capable laboratories and we have a system of very useful response tools already. Let's build on those. They're not perfect, but we have a system in place. Now, I want to, and I'm going to look at my notes here because I want to not miss anything. If you think about it, the National Laboratory System is composed, broadly speaking, of 6 laboratory subsystems that are utilised both in peacetime and in emergency. So these are the government-run public health system, which includes the federal labs, hospital/clinical labs, commercial labs, academic labs, and then urgent care walk-in clinics, temporary pop-up sites and pharmacies, which I've grouped together. It's number 5. And number 6, the use of home testing, which we have to consider. Public health has changed since the pandemic, and while that's not a lab as such with walls, it is producing testing data, and so we have to consider that as a lab. But now there's other components of this system which are non-wet lab based, but they certainly have a role in national laboratory testing. So component 7 is the manufacturer and supplier of both labs-based equipment and over-the-counter tests. Component 8 is government agencies, including FDA, CDC and CMS. And, you know, we can really extend that list a lot. ASPA, BARDA, NIH, RADx, depending on where we want to draw the line. And then number 9 is the national associations that some of which we've heard from today and yesterday that represent and advocate for their members. So that's what I'm looking at as the national system. These subsystems of laboratories and laboratory organisations have different missions, capabilities and capacities. They also serve somewhat different populations. And this has been said before, but the systems are not duplicative, and I think it's important to accept that point. Their missions somewhat overlap, but they're complementary. They're not competitive, in my mind, or they don't have to be competitive, and maybe that's one of the characteristics that we need to think of going forward. So Scott Becker, in his talk yesterday, showed one illustration of the staged manner in which these systems come into play during an emergency. There are definitely other ways to illustrate that, and Ren showed a system yesterday that sort of follows the epi curve. Beth and I have been talking over the last 2 days about how we illustrate a very dynamic system, and clearly we need a video person to show what that looks like, because we're going to have to sell this idea. Okay. If we can accept for the moment that we do have systems within systems and we have emergency response tools, what we don't have, and Joanne referred to this as a playbook, another way of looking at that is a decision matrix of when and how best to use the laboratory resources and the response methods that we have. We need a flexible decision-making tool that evaluates and prioritises a list of response options that can be used by national leaders, state leaders, local leaders to make difficult and complex decisions around testing. And this is the major point that I would like to emphasise. This is a who does what and when and why book. Ren referred to it yesterday as a national roadmap. I think there's multiple things we can call this, and I think we have to figure out the right way to message that so that it's understandable. So how do we facilitate the process of both developing such a decision matrix and getting to consensus on it? And who are the best people to have in the room? So this is where I start with my baby steps. We need senior representatives of the 9 sectors within the national lab system to come together to first develop a governance model and an operating model which will allow future collaborative, granular work. This will no doubt require legal and proprietary input, and I think it'll be hard to get to consensus, but we can do this. And I think that once we have the governing model and the operational model, that may address the issue of functionality that Susan brought up yesterday, that we're lacking at the moment in this very dispersed system that we have currently. And so once we've got that governance model and operational model with the MOUs, as quickly as possible, I think we need subject matter experts from each of the sectors to work together with the input of experts who are good at system thinking. As I said yesterday, I don't think most scientists we're more linear thinkers. And I think we need people who are experts in looking much more globally. And then once we have, and it has to apply to multiple emergency scenarios. It can't be just the pandemic. And then it needs to be tested and drilled against multiple emergency scenarios at different federal, state, and local levels. Now, there are many national discussions going on about what we do next after the pandemic. I want to make you aware of some work that APHL is doing in collaboration with Dr. Jen Nuzzo and Beth Cameron at Brown University. And APHL and others are using this collaboration to prepare a first-generation decision matrix specifically for testing. And some of the people in this room are actually being interviewed as part of that, developing the matrix. And so we see this as a strong baby step toward building the playbook necessary for the bigger picture. And the bigger picture clearly brings in other areas of the healthcare system with added complexity. So I want to leave you with one thing. APHL is one voice. Interest in doing something about the pandemic is waning. I urge you to add your voices to the conversation that's happening in the healthcare system, emergency preparedness, levels of government, legislatures, whatever you can think of, because as many people have said, we're all in this together, but we need multiple voices. And so even though we're not at consensus now what it looks like, I think we can get to consensus that this is a tool that we need. And so I'll finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. Jamie.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today and to participate in these important discussions about envisioning a future model national lab system to ensure that we can effectively respond to public health emergencies both here in the US and in a way that's part of an integrated international response, because we can reasonably expect that large events will be international. So I work at NTI, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan global security organization that is focused on reducing nuclear and biological threats imperiling humanity. And at NTI, I lead the program that's responsible for the biothreat reduction portion of NTI's mission. Our work focuses on strengthening biosecurity and pandemic preparedness and preventing biological events that have the potential to escalate to something that's catastrophic on a global scale. So that's how I don't do, I worked in a lab when I did grad school, but I don't do lab management on a day-to-day basis, so I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective. And so I'll offer 2 key considerations and then 4 recommendations. So one is that we need to be prepared for the unexpected. We here in the US and internationally, we face a broad range of biological risks, naturally emerging, accidentally released, or deliberate. and we need to be prepared for both natural pathogens and increasingly engineered pathogens. Second is we need to think about scale. So it's reasonable to expect that we will see additional biological events in the foreseeable future. COVID-19 is not a once-in-a-century event. Future events could cause damage on the scale of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also reasonable to expect that we could see something potentially even more severe and larger. And so what does that mean for the lab system that we should ideally build here in the US? So 4 recommendations. So 1, an ideal system will need to have lab capacities that are pathogen agnostic. So for example, next generation sequencing is a very useful technology for that kind of capability, but there are certainly other relevant technologies for managing that approach, and that, that kind of capacity is being scaled up within the private sector and probably elsewhere. Second, and this really echoes, I think, some of the conversations yesterday about surge capacity and scale. We need to be able to surge and scale up in the event of very large public health emergency or other high consequence biological event. We've seen during COVID that scaling up testing was a bottleneck. In general, we need to identify what are the bottlenecks to scale. We need to identify the bottlenecks and make plans to scale so we can eliminate these bottlenecks or rate-limiting steps. Examples of bottlenecks are test reagents, equipment, but also workforce. So to address parts of this, we should be figuring out what we can stockpile in terms of consumables and equipment that we think would be broadly useful. But we should also have plans to rapidly scale up production if we hit limits. Something that's interesting to explore is the possibility of using the Defense Production Act during a major public health emergency to address that need. We should also be thinking about how to scale workforce or adapt workforce from one sector to another, as you had suggested. And we need to think, I also want to echo the point that was made a moment ago about having a playbook with triggers. I think that's critical, not only for lab systems, but it definitely applies in this context. We need to think about triggering a proactive response when we see an emerging biological event that has the potential to grow into something that's really large. And we're going to have to be proactive in trigger scale-up of efforts early on, even when we're uncertain about how big the event is going to be, because scale-up has a lag time and we can't afford to wait. We need to stay ahead of a fast-moving event. And so we need to basically take risks and be anticipatory, and we need to have clearly defined triggers for when we hit those decision points. I want to, in just making this particular point, I want to acknowledge a colleague, Jeremy Conendijk. I worked with him a lot on thinking about scale a few years ago when he was at the Center for Global Development before he went into the administration. He's continued to focus on these issues, and I think it's important for this context. 2 more points. One of them is the really hard problem of creating digital systems that can integrate data sharing across this very diverse set of labs that are collecting data. I think, we looked at this a bit when we were researching the space, and I think that my sense is that it's a pretty hard problem. The data sets are pretty fragmented, and it's not trivial to figure out how to integrate it, but I was encouraged to think big, so I'm trying. And I think it's important. Here in the United States, because we have a federated system in terms of healthcare, I think it's harder for us than it is for other countries that have integrated nationalized health systems, and so we have a heavier lift, but I think it's important. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the importance of building in biosecurity and biosafety by design. So to the extent that we're going to, and I do agree with you, we need to keep our eyes on the prize and make sure that we don't fall into the cycle of panic and neglect. It's critical. We should be making investments in national lab capacity, and if we're going to put money on the table for that, we need to set aside resources to make sure we can build in biosecurity and biosafety by design. We need to make sure that the capacity that we're building does not inadvertently contribute to accidental or deliberate misuse of biology that could in itself contribute to biological risks. So thank you so much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jamie. Chris, can you please share your thoughts?
Thank you. So I'm at HHS now, but just to give a little bit of a disclaimer, my perspective here is informed by, in addition to HHS, my time at DOD, at FBI, and at DOE, overseeing or directing laboratory operations and all those different entities. So I may kind of mix in a few different aspects of those here. Anytime I moved into one of these new positions, go into my new office, and my predecessor will have left a huge bookshelf with groaning shelves filled with strategies and implementation plans. And there was often another shelf of lessons learned. Those of you that are in government are probably the ones giggling the most. We have a real talent for producing strategies and lessons learned. What we don't do as well, or at least as often, is prioritization. And that was what often was missing there is, so every couple of years we had to rewrite a new strategy. Well, if we just took the old strategies and just reevaluated them for the prioritization, I would argue that might have been more effective. With the lessons learned, there was lessons learned, but there was never documented of actions taken and results accrued. So that was a frustration. And I guess they expected me to try to help fix that, but it would have been nice to have some more guidance. What did help with guidance and what was peppered in among all those documents oftentimes were National Academies reports. And what they helped with, and what the Academies is great at, and I wasn't set up to say this, but is oftentimes they'll establish a framework for an analysis and an evaluation, which is extremely valuable, and it also has a longer lifetime than the results of that actual review. But that framework and then oftentimes those evaluations contain some prioritization and a little bit deeper analysis. The key, though, is there was a broad set of stakeholders who participated in that. So those committees had a lot of different people from different places, just like here today. So, I was able to participate virtually yesterday for about half the meeting, and today has also been fascinating, and I'm really, happy to see that there's just been so many different perspectives from state and local, the federal component. The professional societies are key in the laboratory consortia. That is extremely important. And, I could go down the list, but everyone who's here, their perspective really adds to that. It helps that prioritization, and it helps sort of help set what the direction should be. And I'll give you one example. A few years ago, I commissioned a study here that resulted in a report called Biodefense in the Age of Synthetic Biology. That came out in 2018, and I still use that report because the framework was so valuable and the analysis was spot on. Two main things that came out of that and that they emphasized, one of which was we got to get beyond the list of biological pathogens that we worry about. And that's come up a couple times in this meeting. And I'll come back to that. The other thing was we need to be focusing not just on the biology, but on the ancillary technologies. And this has also been brought up here. So artificial intelligence, for example, was one of the key areas they brought out that an adversary could use to design, part of the design of synthetic biology and designing the pathogen, a novel pathogen that we weren't prepared for. But it also emphasized that we could use AI to help come up with the mitigation strategy. So they kind of balanced each other. Now, I was asked to come here to talk about chemical issues. And Ava King gave a good talk yesterday, and I think a couple others talked that I didn't get to hear. So she made a lot of the points I was going to make, part of which was this issue of the list, and to get beyond just the list. And it goes by various acronyms and euphemisms, threat agnostic, pathogen agnostic, host-directed therapies, if we're talking about the and then different, agnostic diagnostic systems. Those things hold true for chemistry as well. So even though there's a list of chemical agents that, those that are more in the national security realm are dealing with, and there's a set targets that we've historically used, more and more we need to be mindful of those that are not on that list. And something like the fentanyl threat, and all the different analogs of the fentanyls that could be brought to bear on that. It's not just the public health issues of that, but and the challenges there, but also for what an adversary might do. There was an interesting paper that came out a year ago in Nature Machine Intelligence. There was a conference in Switzerland, and the organizer had asked a company that does AI for drug design. They said, have you ever turned that on its head and see if you could use that for toxin prediction? They never thought about that, so they used it They kind of trained it on some aspects of nerve agent, and they just let it go. Within 6 hours, they generated 40,000 candidate nerve agent compounds. Now, that's not to say that all those could be synthesized and actually used, but there's 40,000 that it identified as candidates. And it's a fascinating set of papers, and if somebody wants to talk to me afterwards, or I can give Lisa the reference if somebody wants to get it. It wasn't so much just the results, but it was the reaction of the people that were in that field. They had never thought about this before. They'd never realized that technology could be used in that way. So it's just a fascinating read just to see not only just the reaction to it as well as the results. So let me come back to why I bring all this up, because I think some of these things have been touched on this meeting already, so I'm just really reemphasizing those. But the outcome of this meeting, I think, is critical. There's been a lot of great ideas put forward. And I know there's going to be a summary report come out, and I would advocate, and whatever I can do to help support this, if there's a follow-on that perhaps that a group could get together and prioritize some of these recommendations, that'd be extremely helpful. When I go to the Hill or, working with the administration on different priorities and different efforts we're contemplating, if I can hold up a National Academies study, and during COVID, I was able to hold up rapid expert recommendations and commentaries that the Academy was able to generate within a few days, that was so helpful. And so that type of thing can be so helpful with both if we try to address the needed policy changes, which have been talked about, legislative and policy changes, but I would argue probably most importantly is funding, if we can justify the funding. And if we can just start with a couple of areas as priorities and build from there, I think that would really build the credibility, and then we can take it on from there. So I'd be willing to, I'm happy to, more than willing, I'm anxious to support that however we can, however I can personally, however ASPR can help in that regard. And so happy to discuss other topics as we go along here, and appreciate everyone putting this together. I think this is an extremely important gathering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to say quickly, you raised a lot of really interesting points that build on what Jamie and Jill have also said, but just the added top level point that what we're talking about here in terms of building a very flexible and adaptable national laboratory system is very closely related to health security and overall national security. And so as that, it's like an incredible priority for this work, or what we're trying to do to succeed. Right, Jonathan.
So thank you for allowing me to speak just for a couple of minutes here. It is absolutely a pleasure for me to be here. My name is John Genzen. I'm Chief Medical Officer at ARUP Laboratories out in Salt Lake City, Utah. ARUP is a nonprofit clinical reference laboratory owned by the University of Utah and its Department of Pathology. So we're both a commercial laboratory and an academic medical center. And so some of my perspectives are really going to come from those two bases. I am also trained as a clinical pathologist with a career focus on chemistry and automation. And as I walk through my list, you're going to get some hues of chemistry and automation and maybe what our future laboratory system could look like. So I will dive in from there. When I originally wrote these down, they actually sounded very small, but I think they could have a really big impact if we took these concepts seriously in a future lab system. So these are really characteristics. So our future laboratory system will promote earlier response. And so we've talked about that in a lot of contexts here already today and this morning. But I really, really mean that. It's a system that promotes innovation, that promotes flexibility early on. It promotes development in many settings, in particular academic medical centers and other hospitals and clinical laboratories, that allows testing to be available as soon as possible, before a public health emergency is declared, really at the time that those clinicians, predominantly infectious disease specialists, realize that there's a problem in the globe and that they've got the time and resources to do it. So number one is promoting earlier response. Number two is incentivizing standardization. And I'm going to give a few examples of this because I think we have not learned our lesson on this, and we have huge room for improvement. So if you go to the doctor and they draw a typical blood chemistry and a typical phlebotomy tube, chances are that blood tube is going to be compatible with every major clinical chemistry analyzer on the market in most hospital labs throughout the country and frankly throughout the globe. You cannot say the same thing about collection tubes used for respiratory swabs. You definitely can't say that about respiratory tubes that contain the swab, and you really, really can't say that when you've got 2 swabs in that tube. But then you imagine what we faced over the pandemic, the diversity of different collection tube types, how they were received, the number of swabs that were in them, the media that were used within them. We have to solve that if we want to standardize and dramatically increase the possibility for additional capacity in the future. So that's bucket number 1 for standardization. Bucket number 2 for standardization relates to pipette tips. I've heard a few people say this already. And I'm going to say this, and I mean this well. This is not coming from a judgmental place. Manufacturers are incentivized to sell disposables. And so you sell more disposables if your disposables are only compatible with your instruments. And if you buy the instrument, you have to buy those disposables. That's just a market reality. But what that does mean is if you have an instrument and you've got a shortage of disposables on that instrument, you are out of luck unless you find those disposables or buy an entirely different system. If we had greater standardization and a way at a federal level to incentivize that standardization, we would have much less risk of that disposable supply chain limitation. Now, granted, you'd have to manufacture those things. You'd still be vulnerable in some way, but I think that lack of compatibility at so many steps along the way with automated instrumentation does hurt standardization. Number 3, we've talked about this a little bit, is scalable solutions. I can't overemphasize that. I'll give you a quick example of how we've tried to address this with Mpox, which is something that we did very different than with COVID-19. When we built our original assay, which was a modified form of the CDC assay, we did in a way so that the reagent, the juice, was not just workable on a 96 or 384 well plate format, but also on a high-volume automated instrument. The same reagent worked on both. And if you design it from the beginning that way, you can scale up in your laboratory setting depending on the volume that's coming into you. So I think that idea, that principle, has a lot of merit and could be used more. Number 4, making overflow capabilities easier. Just because you have an HL7 interface to a laboratory does not mean it is easy to send them 6,000 specimens when you run out of capacity. And I've got to think there are easier ways to share information with batches or bulks of specimens bidirectionally so that overflow capability is much easier. Number 5 is right-sizing regulatory requirements at the time of the emergency. There were certainly times in the COVID-19 pandemic when the paperwork took longer than the testing. And a lot of that is important, but a lot of that is probably not value added depending on the type of testing being done. So streamlining when it's appropriate is key. And there are good examples of streamlining during the pandemic, but I think we could do more. And last but not least, the future laboratory system has seriously addressed the clinical laboratory workforce shortage, because we are out of luck if we don't solve that now and there's a future emergency. And that workforce shortage in the clinical laboratory and public health laboratory sector is very real and really could benefit from a federal solution. Those were the concepts I wrote down. I could talk all afternoon about any of them, but I'll pause here.
All right, thank you very much. And before we go to questions from the audience and online, I do want to ask a couple questions. You know, one key takeaway that actually most of you touched on is that, you know, all the partners that we've been talking about over the last few days have strengths and other areas where they're not as strong or even weaknesses. And these strengths and weaknesses can become more or less important depending on where we are on the epi curve. And so if we rely on any one solution or any one sector, obviously it's a recipe for failure. But on the other hand, if we find a way to work together and complement each other in a coordinated manner, we all become stronger, right? Because we're complementing each other. And so I think the big question for this meeting, which I decided to just hit on right off the bat, is, you know, as we think about what a coordinated national laboratory system looks like, and thinking about governance, thinking about structure, thinking about, you know, who helps to lead it. Are there existing models that we can learn from in either entirely different fields or adjacent fields that might help us think about how we would structure this and how we would build it?
So maybe my answer is more emphasizing how important that question is. Because having, you know, been around in government when the stand-up of DHS, and this is not to criticize what happened, but a lot of that was creating new entities and new capabilities. Whereas maybe some of those already existed, and if we just spent a little bit more time studying it and tweaking it a little bit, we might be able to come up with a different solution. And maybe my example is how I got to know Joanne. The FBI had a certain capability, but it wasn't complete, and we used some of the DHS assets and others, but there was a little bit of a mismatch between what we were doing and what CDC was doing when the public health and the forensics requirements didn't seem like they matched. And so the assumption on everybody's side was, we got to go over and develop our own systems independently. And so I took a team down to Atlanta, locked them in a room with Joanne and some of her people, and said, figure this out. And to her credit, I give her the credit for leading that effort. And we resolved it. And we came up with a common solution that we were able to avoid duplication, reduce cost. The attorneys loved it. I mean, it was great. And it answered the public health needs as well as the forensics needs for both law enforcement as well as counterterrorism and national security. So I'm just saying there's examples out there. I've talked to a couple of people. There's some things going on in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which may seem like that's way too far outside the bounds for what we're talking about mainly here. But there's things that NRC does to coordinate as an independent government agency. It's not tied to certain industries, or it's not part of DOE, for example, that they're able to do a lot as that independent entity. Now, I'm not necessarily arguing that we need to create a different entity, but we could look at what NRC is doing and see other things we could draw from that. It's almost like this whole topic, I think all of us, because there's so many different perspectives here, so many different experiences, that I think that's, so let's try to see if we can make a small tweak to what's already out there, and we might have a great solution.
So I'm very much in brainstorming mode because I think this is an important but hard question. And what I'm reflecting back on is just thinking about how the health systems, both in the United States and internationally, actually performed better than during COVID for scale up than I expected. I thought that our systems were going to collapse under strain at scale, and I was actually quite impressed. And one example is the New York health system, and Syra is here from New York, and we also saw some really interesting examples in the UK where I was living during the pandemic. And I think, one interesting example is that here, hospital systems had all sorts of workforce bottlenecks during the COVID pandemic, and people, when there was a need, they found workarounds. They found ways to rapidly certify medical personnel, but to move between systems. And I think those kinds of, I think we should look at the things that worked during COVID, where we were sort of making things up on the fly during a crisis, and see what we can capture and maybe institutionalize and apply in other contexts. And maybe this is an example of that kind of thing. Can we think about ways to move personnel between different jurisdictions or different sectors so that they can surge where they're needed, because there may be a buildup of personnel in one place where they're really needed elsewhere, and can we reduce the regulatory bottlenecks or hurdles to certify people to do that? So that's one example. Perhaps another example is just, the health systems performed things that I thought were downright miraculous during COVID. We built, the UK government built this whole Nightingale large-scale facility to treat lots of patients in London, and I think in New York, the New York health system did similar heroic feats. So I think that there were, and I'd be interested to see if anyone has captured how that worked, what people tried, what worked and what didn't, and is that applicable? Is that applicable in this context? Can we think about pop-up capabilities or scale-up capabilities in a lab context? Is that an analogy that we should explore? Thanks.
Okay, so my first thought when looking at this question that Joanne gave us was maybe the Canadian health system. The UK system is a bit worrying at the moment with the strikes, and it might have done really well. And I think of the genomics effort in the UK, which was way ahead of anyone else, except maybe the Israelis. But the reality is US does not have a national health system. It is never going to have a national health system. Even though there are good things about it, it isn't going to happen. So it's kind of like we have to accept who we are and what we have and meet in the middle and find where we overlap and what's in it for each of the sectors, if you like. While there are many for-profit companies involved in here, I'm okay with the fact that they're a for-profit company, but I also think for-profit companies have a social conscience, and that's what we need to appeal to. So I don't have a system in mind, but I think we're smart enough to create one where there's something in it for everybody if we think carefully.
Yeah, and I agree with that too. I think why we may do something is different. The question is, do we have common goals in different parts of response? And are there ways for us to work together to achieve those goals? Kind of collective action towards shared goals is what I'm thinking. And John, I know the clinical sector already works with a whole bunch of different partners, so this shouldn't be like entirely new to you. So from your experiences, have you learned something over the years that could help us in our thinking?
I'm probably adding my own emotion to this, but I would say throughout the pandemic, all of the transformative moments that we experienced in the lab were based on collaborations with colleagues, with people within the laboratory, with our vendors at the time. And if we learn from that experience and the fact that when we're working together and not just closing off, we can actually achieve things that are far greater than what we could have done independently. I recognize the concept about not having a national health system, and I agree we will probably never have that, and I'm not taking a position for or against one. But we were desperately hurt by not having standardized demographic information database that we could easily funnel with test results and easily gather. The clinical laboratory sector was really challenged with providing information that it didn't have and slowing down testing, trying to find that information that we were required to report. So in that future laboratory system, if there is a way to generate and share that information more easily, I think it could actually speed up testing and make life easier.
Thank you. And the other quick point I wanted to make is, like you mentioned clearly, the incredible change, accelerated change across the board that happened over the last 3 years. You're left on things as diverse as telework, which was supposed to happen within 15 years, as I recall, and happened overnight. And of course, warp speed was the other big success story. In reality, the question is, well, why can't we do that now, right? And so thinking about what did we learn, how did we do things so quickly, and how can we continue to do that in the future at that pace, or at least something close to that, I think is really important. Did you have a comment? No. Okay. The other question I have is that the reality is the U.S. already has a wide array of partners, public, academic, private partners that collaborate routinely to address day-to-day health needs, right? We do that every day. There's been a lot of change, rapid technological change, growing global interconnectedness through travel and trade, urbanization, and other factors that drive change that we need to adapt to. And so future public health threats, and I think this was mentioned in one of the earlier panels, really may necessitate having less time to prepare and the need to respond immediately at scale. And this is certainly true of chemical and radiological threats in general. And so asking a very basic question here, but why isn't the current approach working for how this community works together, and what are some potential strategies we might want to prioritize for improvement over the next couple of years? Hey, Chris.
I'll start maybe. So one of I think it's part of the American psyche, an American approach to things oftentimes is to look to technology as the solution. And granted, the mRNA vaccine technology was amazing, and other things that went on, technologically speaking, were amazing. The logistics that went on was amazing, and logistics was mentioned this morning. It's not a National Academy of Logistics. There's some professional societies, but so that's one thing I worry about. I mean, right now I know who to call in FedEx and UPS high enough up that we could make things happen. And at the time, you talk about the swabs many of you have the horrors when you think about that from your perspective from the lab. I think about trying to arrange military transport for getting, millions of swabs moved over from Europe so that they could be distributed to you so you could have your own individual experiences with them. We figured out how to do it. We formed the relationships. During Warp Speed, an executive from FedEx and UPS were in HHS headquarters with us. They were part of Operation Warp Speed. You hear about the government people, but Walgreens, CVS, I'm going to get in trouble for leaving people out, but they were embedded with us, and we were focused on solutions together. And there's a little bit of a legacy there. I know who to call now, but there's going to be some turnover in time. I'll be gone, they'll be gone, and those personal relationships won't be there. But we've not really set anything in place to be able to maintain that and to instantly get that started back up again. So some of those things need to be created, and I think I've completely veered away from your question, but
no.
But it's. I mean, a lot of what's been talked about today. The technological solutions that are needed. A lot of what I was talking about with these lists and things. I mean, things like, sequencing, high-resolution mass spectrometry, other things that I think we need to get into the laboratory. So believe me, I'm not saying we don't need to focus on technological solutions and getting those more broadly accepted, but we've got to focus on the logistics. We've also had to focus on the behavioral science aspects. One of the things that the committee that I currently sponsor, the Academies, we've partnered very strongly with a sort of a sister committee here, Sean, and I always have to have Lisa remind me what Sean stands for, but it's behavioral sciences, because that way we could look at sort of the human factors and the communication systems and other things that we needed to address there. So it's just so many different pieces need to be brought in that it can be overwhelming. But I still go back to the fact that I think we could still, amongst ourselves, prioritize some things to get moving out on while we still maintain these other broader discussions.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is on track too, because you're really talking about how do we create systematic processes that aren't really dependent on personal relationships and who you know in one or in different organizations, and that's really an important part of it. And the other thing too that I know we talked about in an earlier session is buying down risk, right? And so again, creating a little bit more time. So if we have to less time to prepare and have to respond at scale, it means we have to do a lot of the legwork up front and have it ready. So this concept of pre-UA diagnostics, I think, is really important. Also, the idea of what tools and what could we do to detect threats earlier, because then that buys us time. Like if we had detected that, we actually have cases, let's say hypothetically in Washington State in December, think about what a game changer that could have been. So how do we build in processes like that? Jamie.
So I think I wanted to offer a hypothesis about why we have struggled to respond at scale. And I think it's because until pretty recently, we weren't thinking about scale, at least not for biology. And I have very clear recollections of going to international meetings where we talk about biological risks. And, before the pandemic, you really had to stick your neck out and make the case that, Ebola was very serious in Africa, and it was a tragedy, and we should have responded better, and it was very challenging. But people were thinking about things at that scale. And I remember sitting in an international meeting at Wilton Park in the United Kingdom, and there was very fancy surroundings with lots of fancy, smart people saying important things. And I just said, look, we need to be prepared for something that's going to hit us on multiple continents, that could be, 1 million cases or 1 million deaths, not a few thousand. And people just didn't engage with that perspective because it wasn't fathomable to them at the time. And the response was, well, these smaller scale things are bad enough. let's focus on, like, that's bad enough. How could you dismiss these smaller things? I'm not. I'm just saying if we have to scale, we are not ready, and if we have to experience a large-scale event, we're in big trouble because we're thinking about it at this scale, and we need to 10x it, 100x it, 100,000x it. So if I'm going to offer, I can't tell you for sure why we're struggling, but I would offer the hypothesis that the failure to think about scale until pretty recently is probably a piece of it. And we need to change that. And I think if we're going to, like, we should make plans that, like, incorporate these logistical considerations and try to capture the lessons and the experiences that you thought were beneficial and exercise them with some regularity. I mean, obviously that applies to lab systems and the broader response system. That seems self-evident to me, but perhaps it bears repeating.
And can I add one thing to that too? We have to find a way to solve the economic problem of pending unused capacity. On a clinical lab side, it is really expensive to hold a space or hold a set of instruments or keep people trained or keep an assay validated if you're not actually running testing on that routinely. And so to expect to be able to pivot quickly from 0 to 100 without any real financial mechanism for a lab to support that in that unknown interim period of time is just really challenging. It's hard to think through.
And probably even harder for a public health lab. Yeah. The one thing I wanted to throw out, we did some dabbling with strategic foresight to try to think about what are the risks of the future, right? And the methodology, as we learned about it, I thought was really interesting because you don't think about just one scenario. You really start looking at what's changing technologically, otherwise, for a given threat, what are the range of possibilities? Not one scenario, but a range of possibilities, and then look for signals. What are the signals that would tell us that we're really more like, scenario 3 out of the 50,000 or 4? And I think that's kind of a big mind shift in how we prepare. So we could look at variables like transmissibility, right? It could be something like SARS that's more or less transmissible, or we can look at other variables to help us think about what the range of possible is, and then to really ensure that we make strategic investments in our preparedness and response infrastructure and build the partnerships we need, to have the flexibility to respond to a lot of them, and also for some high consequence scenarios, able to actually make sure we're able to respond to those as well. But at least we're not thinking that Ebola is really based on the past is only going to do X, Y, and Z, but we're thinking much more broadly to begin with. And I think that gets to some of what you're talking around scale and thinking differently from the very beginning.
One thing, I want to correct something I said in my talk. I left out One Health and I left out pharmacies, and that's what I've learned yesterday. So I want to add that to the National Laboratory System. Bill from Quest, can we call you Bill or you will, right, talked this morning about using the data from commercial labs on ordering. Not on results, but on ordering. Think about using that. Think about using drugstore sales of Advil, and all the cold medicines in a particular region. Social media. Oh, Mary says I've got a terrible headache and a fever. I mean, we've got to be imaginative in using other sorts of data. Now, the Center for Forecasting and Analytics that's been set up at CDC, I was hoping that they would be very forward-looking, using work like Trevor Bedford's on, all the pathogens. I think they haven't got the funding for that part yet, so they're sort of looking more after the boom rather than before the boom. But I think we have to invest in as many forward-looking, predictive, accept that there'll be a lot of noise in them, but there's important information in them to give us as much of a heads up as we can get to be ready.
All right. The next question has to do with, the reality is, although we all would like everything to go faster, during the COVID-19 response, commercial tests were really up and running within 2 months of the sequence getting published for SARS-CoV-2. So although we always wish things to be faster, to be honest, that was pretty remarkable in many ways. The question here is, what could we have done differently, particularly, early in a response when, quite honestly, specimens aren't available. You have the genetic sequences, and that's all. Around how we validate methods early in a response. And additionally, as the response continued, one of the things that we learned is that response isn't stagnant. It wasn't a single epicurve, it was multiple epicurves. And so we also need to be thinking about how we adapt to new variants, which have the potential to affect tests, vaccines, and other things that we have developed as interventions. So, how do we prepare faster to begin with the initial tests? What could we do differently? And Jill, I think you've talked a little bit about this in the past. And then how do we continue to grapple more effectively with the emergence of new variants throughout the event?
So I'll be quick. One, we have to incorporate redundancy into test development. Different platforms from the perspective of supplies, but also addressing variants in genomic sequence, but also, if a lab fails, there's still a support system. I had another thought and it's gone, I'm sorry. No, let somebody else go.
John, do you have any thoughts, or Chris?
It just relates a little bit to what I said earlier about early innovation. I don't know exactly what that structure could look like, but I'm pretty confident with a whiteboard in an hour, people could figure out what some kind of pre-certification, pre-EUA process that encouraged innovation, but also had some accountability associated with it, and that was right for the right setting. I think as I look back on our experience during COVID-19 and the thought of tests as being manufactured, maybe in our minds we always thought about building a test and then scaling it out nationwide and it has to be perfect. Maybe that's not quite the right set of expectations for that first couple of weeks when you're trying to get something to work, when you're trying to help that population in your setting. Maybe there's different degrees of innovation and readiness, and you could find a way to evolve that from that early stage into something that maybe is more robust and distributable, which I think is different than scalable locally.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I have a question related to that, because I was curious. I had a problem a few years ago at the FBI laboratory. We'd been trying to solve this for years, but we were all scientists and had been working at this thing with our perspective as scientists. And it's a longer story than it's interesting. But anyway, we brought in, just happened to have an opportunity to bring in an MBA who was top-notch, had experience, and also had an engineering background, but clearly was going to look at this thing from a business standpoint. And he did an analysis, used some of it was just classical project management concepts, but also just looked at some other things from a hard business analysis case, not just looking at it from a scientific or a technical solution. So I'm not saying that that's not important. This is to complement that. And long story short, we solved it. And he was a hero. And I took all the credit because I hired him. But it was, but I guess my question is, especially some of y'all from some of the companies, is there a way to maybe bring in some of these other disciplines to maybe help look at these things? And I'm thinking of a business. This would be a lot of what I saw during COVID. I kept thinking if I could just get before the Harvard Business School and give them this as a business case that they could do an analysis on, but we just didn't have time to do all that. I'm just curious if anybody else took that approach, and because I'm just a big fan now of as a scientist looking beyond the scientific solution. Recognizing you need the science, but some of these other. Do you have any? Could you share that? Maybe the microphone behind you. I'm sorry, Joanne. I don't mean to.
Yep. Kendra Ford, New York City Health and Hospitals, and we certainly did. And by training, by background, years in the laboratory, and our laboratories in general. Rigid, very science-minded, very. So we did it. We were desperate. We opened the doors during the pandemic, but we had to get out of our own way. and we built very complementary teams. I don't know if we would have gotten there had it not been for the pandemic, and I'm not proud to say that, but we are doing much better now, and it's pretty routine for us. And it's not an MBA, it can be something else tomorrow, but we are creating very diverse teams that are, everybody's strong at something, but we're looking for the diversity. And I think we're doing a good job of it now and intend to get better at it.
Okay, thank you. Jamie?
So I just wanted to this question about how to move faster at various points, especially early. I wanted to pick up on a point that Jonathan made that I thought was important, which is I think we have to be flexible about our specifications. There's this triangle, like you can get something fast and it can be good and it can be cheap, but it's very hard to get all three. And I think we have to think about things in that way. The idea that we're going to rapidly deploy a test that's like highly specific and very sensitive, and we're going to scale it. I think that's, at least early on, it's going to be really hard, and we have to figure out what are we willing to compromise on in order to scale quickly. We should be asking, are we being overly conservative in our expectations for specificity and sensitivity and waiting for the perfect to be the enemy of the good? Or is it better in some instances to just really rapidly scale a test that's perhaps a little bit less sensitive or a little less specific, but you can cover a lot of people really quickly, and that has benefit and a value and expectation, even though there's going to be some sort of error rate that's higher than usual. We need to have tolerance for that kind of imperfection if we're going to scale quickly during a crisis. And my gut is that is in expectation a better outcome than waiting for something better to come along later and letting those cases spread.
Jill?
I want to build on that and go to the point of use of home use tests. There's a public expectation now that there will be a test that I can use in my home and know I've got the flu or whatever. Now, the bad side of that is I might ignore the result and go to work anyway because I, need to feed my family. But let's assume that at least a majority of the population will use them and take actionable public health action based on the result. If we had a standard platform available, an antigen-based test, the trouble is you've got to have a good antibody up front. But a PCR, you can make primers really fast. LAMP you can do at room temperature. There are some companies out there which are actually investigating much better polymerases that are very accurate and very stable. If we had a platform for room temperature PCR, and okay, you'll need a toaster-sized module to run it, but you could use it in the pharmacy, you could use it in an airport, you could use it in schools. Results in 15 minutes. Maybe not perfect, but that could be an early tool. If we invest in that sort of technology, that could be an early tool till we get to make the perfect tests. Just a thought.
Yeah, and I like that idea because one of the other things that came up is like you go to a manufacturer, let's say to produce an OTC, where they may have to shift their production line, right? But if we can harmonize somewhat on the platforms, right? So there's benefit, and then take away this artificial wall between biothreats as an example and kind of routine healthcare, HIV, STDs, and other things. You then have processes that are already in place. You've got your warm base that it's less of a pivot to try to change it when the need comes, and you have like something like SARS-CoV-2. Yeah. You touched on this in the last few minutes, but I'm going to pull the thread a little bit more, which is we've talked a lot about laboratory partners, but there's much more to it than that, right? In order to make this laboratory system work, we're going to have to reach out and work with many others in different sectors. We've talked about workforce. There's a safety aspect. Someone yesterday talked very knowledgeably about specimen transport issues and the logistics around that. And I think you mentioned AI and early warning, but it's completely true. Like, if you can leverage AI to help us to understand, what communications are out there, what people are reporting on social media and in other places, these are also other ways of building in that early warning capability that can inform lab and help us inform whether we do things faster or not, but are kind of outside the laboratory sphere. Do you have thoughts on, and John, I'm going to look to you, but do you have thoughts on what are some of these other kind of areas that support laboratory work, can inform laboratory work, but maybe involve other partners that are not that traditional to us?
This may deviate a little bit from that, but I think about the early Mpox wave that we saw in the spring and the number of cases that would come in where Mpox wasn't even on the radar screen when you reached back to the clinician to kind of ask about, were they suspecting this? I think there's an opportunity for finding the right way for public awareness. I may not be saying that quite well, but early in an infectious disease threat in particular, it's just not on top of mind for a lot of clinicians and providers. And maybe having better ways to at least increase that recognition might help. I talked a little bit about that partnership with vendors too. That's in a very different direction, but I can't emphasize how helpful it was throughout the pandemic when you had a cooperative vendor who was actively engaged in understanding the issue the lab was having or troubleshooting based on that. It's counter to the usual dynamic where once something is FDA clear and approved, it's locked in and you are stuck, and that is the way you have to run it. And then you realize the world isn't quite like that and things break and you've got to find ways to fix them. I know I'm going a little bit away from your original question, but it is equally important to that clinician awareness part of it.
And just pulling on this thread a little bit more, Jill, you did mention pharmacies and the important role pharmacies play, and we'll touch on that in the last question before we get to any audience questions. But to me, that they're also an important partner, and I know funding for that program is going away as the public health emergency declaration will conclude. What sort of role do you see for them playing in future responses? Is this a useful warm base for us?
I think it's a very useful warm base, and I think so I have a car, I can go to the drive to the doctor or whatever. Think about underserved, poorer communities. You can go to the pharmacy when you get your groceries. It's just much more convenient. They wear white coats, so are they trusted? I don't know, but like scientists wear white coats, we're not trusted. I think that we have to think about the underserved communities really hard. Partners are trusted people in that community that trust us and are trusted by the community. And to me, if I was still at Wadsworth, that's what I would do differently. I use the word porous. Our walls need to be more porous. We need to get out in the community and serve the community because we're just not reaching them for so many things. Look at STIs. And I think we have to think really strongly and proactively and outside the box to serve that community because they're our clients as much as people, who've got cars and houses and a good living.
Yeah, Chris.
Just a good example of that, the mayor of Washington tells a good story. She was having a difficult time because, those of you from D.C., there's a huge immigrant, very heterogeneous immigrant community in D.C. from all over the world. And there was one particular group that she recognized was very low in vaccine uptake. And so she went and met with some community leaders there, the community leaders, the church leaders, and others. And her story is as she found one particular minister of a church who was one of the big leaders in that community. had a good discussion with him, and he just opened up the church. So people that may have been unwilling to trust her and all the people in the white coats and everybody else in town that look like me, that were trying to do this, she opened up the church. And so things were in their language. People look like them were there answering questions. And so that was, these are the non-traditional partners. Tyler Perry did a beautiful job when we were all trying to figure out how can we reach out to the, especially to the black community more effectively. He just did it. His piece on Black Entertainment Television, if you haven't seen it, it just almost brings tears to my eyes because he knew how to communicate with that community because it was his community. So I'm just saying and I tend to focus a little bit because so many of the barriers tended to be, again, like vaccine uptake and some other things that once we solve the technological problem and the logistics and other things, well, then we have that other problem, people not taking it. So I think this is a great question, and there's a lot of brainstorming that's going on right now, is how can we, again, make those kind of connections more permanent, and hopefully we've built some trust that then the next time it would carry on.
Yeah, and part of the reason for the question, too, is, again, we think about a lab system. We tend to think of very traditional ways we've done it in the past. And I think the pharmacy work, also the free over-the-counter tests that were provided during COVID, helped to address some of the issues around getting testing to all of our communities. But I think there's a lot more we have to do in terms of thinking about how we build that into the existing laboratory testing system.
Can I just add something to that? So we're thinking about going to Congress because ultimately we need funding for all of this. Addressing the DEI issues, the equity issues with funding for exploring how to reach these communities with technologies that work there may be something that we can use to say, this is what's in it for you.
If I could, just one more bite at this. The example I gave you with Mayor Bowser, it was almost exactly what happened over 20 years ago with Whitman Walker Clinic addressing the HIV problem in D.C. They reached out to the non-traditional parts of the community, and they did that. But it wasn't codified and documented in such a way that we could just pick that up and that's what we'll institute here. It had to be kind of be reinvented. So it's just how do we make sure we can, kind of keep this kind of mindset going? And again, these partnerships are so important.
So we've gone full circle to prioritize and act as the key takeaways. So we have some questions in the room. If you could please provide your name and affiliation.
Sure. So I'm Sarah Madan. I'm with New York City Health and Hospitals and the Harvard Belfer Center. So my question is beyond lab capacity and lab capability, but it's more on the crucial role of risk communication. And as we talk about who needs to get tested, where they can get tested, and for MPOX, as we looked at the at-risk community, which was very different than COVID-19, for example, and how that kind of changed over time. We also know we're living in a time where trust in science is at an all-time low. Trust in established agencies is at an all-time low. So as we look at a model national laboratory system, what role does risk communication play as we look at redundancy and the like? So we'd love to hear from you all.
Risk communication from whom and to whom? If I'm talking to an undocumented immigrant who has 4 kids and lives in a little tenement apartment, it's a totally different conversation than if I'm talking to a middle-class person like me. And who's doing the risk communicating? So I think we have to tailor our message in a very respectful, non-patronising way to who the audience is.
It's less about the message, but it's having redundant systems in place. So it's having redundant systems in place to amplify that message, right? We can't just rely on CDC. We all love CDC, but we can't just rely on CDC to give that communication to the public, knowing that there's very low trust already. So how can we build in within these academic institutions, commercial entities, and the like to be echo chambers to say, hey, these are the individuals who are eligible. This is where you can get tested. This is why it's important. I think those types of communication to the public from multiple different avenues are so important. You can't just have all your ducks or all your balls in one basket in that sense.
You're absolutely right. But then maybe we go to was it Tyler Perry? I'm not sure I know who Tyler Perry is, but I guess he's a young hero. I'm showing my age. But, we've got to use other role models in society to pass that message.
Yeah, I agree. It's very much that. It's not even going through the channels, although the channels you described are helpful. It's also making communications actionable and not so complicated that people are left not really understanding what to do. And that's a huge thing we have to overcome.
I would add to that, we all have a role to play in communicating that risk and in education as well. The laboratory community is not a community that's typically out front in the media. Many of the spokespeople throughout the entire pandemic were non-laboratorians who were talking about lab testing. And if we all take that responsibility to be more open and upfront and to educate, even if it's directly our own colleagues, our own staff, I think it can make that same type of impact. We did something very similar to that with vaccines, and it kind of took off in a way that we didn't expect it to, because we just knew there was a lack of understanding about how the vaccines worked. We developed educational material for vaccines, started spreading that widely, and then spread it publicly. And I think it made a difference. It certainly did in our own local community.
I would also quickly add that more people know about testing now than ever before in the United States, and that's something we need to quickly build upon before that knowledge is lost. And Corey, you've been standing a long time, so I'll go to you.
Picking up on it, Corey Meyer, Griffin Scientific. So two comments for the panel to react to. So first, picking up on the thread of home testing and pharmacy testing, another way that I think is useful to think about the utility of that is that it minimizes disruption to the person getting tested. So the equity angle is really, really important, but also it's easy to do a test at home, get the result in 15 minutes, go on your day if it's negative, or go to the pharmacy. The public, we saw a really strong reaction to the disruption caused by public health measures imposed by public health officials that then led to backlash. So I think continuing to message that and support home testing as a way to foster testing but minimize disruption is a good thing. And then second comment is that we've been focused on national lab system, but I think it needs to have a global reach. Joanne, you mentioned access to specimens, right? Most likely, the next big infectious disease outbreak is going to originate abroad. It's important for us to have access to specimens, to data, to have early awareness and be able to build tests, develop tests. So CDC has great global reach, and I think as part of the system and thinking about the future of the system, it's valuable to be really thoughtful about strengthening and sustaining those partnerships, ensuring there's a lot of reciprocity in the partnership, especially as we see a lot of capacity being built up abroad for diagnostics, which is wonderful. We can't assume partners will share back with the U.S., but really have to focus on being good partners and sustaining those relationships.
Thank you. I think you've just added to one of the functions that we're going to have to build into the system. So, Susan.
Susan Banmeter, American Clinical Laboratory Association. This is a great panel. Thank you all for your comments and your thoughtfulness and advice, and even just some of these questions here too. So a few observations. I mean, we're talking about scale and the importance of public-private partnerships and prioritizing some of the ideas that we've had. We've had different mechanisms mentioned, like the DPA, et cetera. And really sort of two main comments from me based on just observing this panel. One is I think we are missing manufacturers in this discussion. And I think I mentioned that during the pandemic, I had spent most of my time working for diagnostics manufacturers who are almost all global companies. So when we think about how do we have that reach to pull in samples from other places, global surveillance, they are doing that, right? Part of their business case is to do that surveillance and to have those relationships too. So I think it's important to bring them in. And then the second comment that's actually related, and it's also a plug, so forgive me, but ACLA did co-author a report, the proposed a proposal for a national diagnostics action plan with Gigi Granville, Tom Inglesby, and others at Johns Hopkins. And we actually we did interviews with public and private sector leaders, so CEOs of global diagnostics manufacturing companies, folks from CDC, CMS, FDA, large laboratories, et cetera. And we took the time and pain to prioritize, and we have 11 specific recommendations we've sent up to the Hill, including with some legislative language. A couple of things got into the PREVENT Act, but hopefully that is all helpful to us all as we think about how do we prioritize, because I think the window here for action is small, and so we are very willing to be partners with anyone here. And just that experience on manufacturing, it wasn't always clear during the pandemic, but the DPA was used dozens of times with diagnostics manufacturers, and certainly many others. So thank you.
Maybe just one comment, because somebody made the comment earlier today about warranties being voided and some issues with the manufacturers. I mean, I guess maybe just, again, you just triggered that thought again, but there's right now we're at a period of goodwill and good cooperation, or at least good communication in most cases with these manufacturers. This is the time to maybe address that. I don't know if a subset of this group could then, I'm sure you could have a Fed involved in this, but I would advocate for somebody to get before because I've spent 10 years in that world before I entered federal service, and I just think I'd just be curious if this group, or maybe a subset of this group, could maybe go to that and make the case and to get that one small issue taken away that still is a big impact.
I don't work for the manufacturers any longer, but Ren Salerno and Tim Stenzel, as they had mentioned, have been bringing manufacturers together. We've had meetings with our large member laboratories too, and I think there's been some progress made. It was around some very particular circumstances, but I do think we need to see some further clarity from our colleagues at FDA and CDC, because I am hearing from the large commercial labs there is still a concern, maybe not a voided warranty, but a real lack of clarity about how do you handle how do you properly ensure that your instruments are decontaminated, right? And I think we just need clarity from the manufacturers, but hopefully we'll get there. And sorry for.
Andy Pavia, University of Utah. Sue's report, which I just downloaded but haven't read, may have many of these ideas in it. But Joanne, you asked, I think, the panel to imagine perhaps that it was January 3rd of 2020 and we had an ideal laboratory system, and what would that look like? And I don't think everyone quite addressed that. And I think one of the next steps we could take, because this is a workshop and it won't have formal recommendations, would be to have the different stakeholders put together their idea of, it's now January 3rd, 2024, and there are 5 fatalities due to H5N1 in poultry workers. What would the ideal lab system that we want to have ready then look like? And if we do it from multiple perspectives, we have a manufacturer, a Fed, a state and local, and a large commercial lab think about it, and then we put it together, we might be able to synthesize a lot of the ideas that have come up in the last 2 days.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And we can take some of what this group has talked about in the workshop, where you're looking at key functions or different parts of that epi curve and who plays in which, who are the right players to include, and then sort of take a deep dive in each one of those areas. I think that would be great. And the other thing is, one of the things we've started doing at CDC is, instead of just doing these full-blown exercises, we do what we call micro exercises, where we focus narrowly on a particular series of questions and bring the right partners together to kind of do that deep dive. And I think that's a great idea and a great topic.
Yeah, and I've never seen laboratory capacity in any of the flu exercises I've been part of. I've never seen any discussion of it.
First functional exercise was 2014. That says a lot right there.
Hi, I'm Andy Scott. I'm in the DHS Office of Health Security, and I'm the PM for ICLN, the Integrated Consortium of Laboratory Networks. I just wanted to touch on a few things that the panel members brought up. An awesome panel, really enjoyed it. So Jill, I don't know if it was embedded in there, but I would suggest that maybe standards labs or standard setting organizations is in there somewhere as well. And I think we brought up standardization, Jonathan did. So maybe we should consider that as something that we would include. I think we talked a little bit about other kinds of specialties or people that could bring some insight to the fight. I think we talked about, Chris, you brought up human factors. I thought that was awesome. I think some of the discussions surrounded communication. So I really think we need a communicator to consider these issues, and maybe even a psychologist. So kind of getting outside the box. And then I'm really glad, Jill, that you brought up One Health, because that was one of my check marks too. And I like the idea of the consideration of what would we do now today. I would piggyback on top of that. What if we had, in conjunction with the biological event, a chemical and a radiological event? Lots of complexity there, lots of different concerns, similar but different concerns, to cover all of our bases across the analytical laboratory kind of enterprise. And another thing that Chris touched upon, lessons learned, out the wazoo, we got, quote, lessons learned. I would propose that we have lessons discussed and written down. We didn't learn them until we institutionalize them and we put concerted, persistent, cross-sector effort against addressing those lessons. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments on our side? No. Last question.
Hi, I'm Joe Anelli with the National Association of Federal Veterinarians. And as sort of a semi-outsider, I have some observations of things that I've heard and seen. One of them is that my head is about to explode from the 1,000 different points that you've identified needing improvement and focus on, and money and so on. The other thing, though, that I've heard consistently are phrases that are very common in the One Health concept. We've talked about partnerships. We've talked about bringing, one of the things I've always said about One Health is I don't know what I don't know. So when I sit down to solve a problem, if I bring together those people that I'm aware of that are involved in the problem, we all have the same level of thinking about those problems. If we bring in those external MBA partners or folks from elsewhere, you bring them together, you identify what the problem is, and you have some folks that either step up and say, yeah, I can contribute to that, or folks that step back and say, no, I really don't have a role in this at all. So that One Health concept is an ideal way to approach what you're talking about here. Something that's happened that I want to give USAID a lot of credit for is they received a great deal of money to implement One Health throughout the world. So they have been working with many countries that have truly institutionalized One Health within their government structures, and from their government structures through universities and through private industry and so on. The only challenge is that none of that money was available for the United States, so we did none of that. So we have a very rudimentary One Health approach that is based on personal relationships. There is an interagency One Health working group that has somebody from, for example, EPA, that it's not part of their job. They just happen to be extremely committed to the concept and tries bringing it into EPA. Something that did get passed last year, there was a bill called the Improving Emergency Preparedness Through One Health Act. It, in its entirety, did not get passed, but components of it did get passed in the omnibus appropriations bill, and it was calling for a framework for the implementation of One Health. So I've heard some things here about getting Congress to get engaged in some of these issues that you're talking about. There's already a congressional oversight group that's looking into what's happening with this One Health framework activity. I can almost bet that the laboratory systems that you have been talking about is probably not going to be included in the first iteration of that, merely because I was part of that group, and when we talked about it, the laboratory systems were not a key component of it. It is CDC that was identified as being the lead in working on this framework for federal agencies and beyond. And it would probably be worth looking at the One Health office, which is probably handling that, to try and include something about laboratory systems. The other thing that I kept hearing was the funding that was needed. And the reality is we are all in competition with each other for that funding. So the challenge is, as each of these activities go forward, Congress is left with a big laundry list of things that are high priorities that need funding. But where do they go with that? And you're all talking about partnerships. Well, if they go in one direction, it's one agency that gets the funding. How do they distribute that to the other agencies or to the states and so on? So another bill that's going to be introduced shortly by Senator Gillibrand and Senator Joni Ernst is called the One Health Security Act. And I think if you guys, when that comes out, could read that, one of the things it does is it establishes a council within the executive office of the president. And that council is going to get funding not by individual appropriations committees, but it will get funding that goes to the Office of Management and Budget. And then the council will sit down and identify what their One Health priorities are, one of which hopefully will be the laboratory systems that you're talking about. And then it will identify who needs to be involved in solving this particular problem. And the various groups that are involved sort of raise their hands and say, we have a role in this. And then it is the Office of Management and Budget that then looks at the level of effort that each of those groups needs to fulfill their component of it and gets funding that way. So that you now have a project funded across multiple partners. And I think a key component of what you guys have been talking about is that One Health concept and looking at mechanisms by which One Health can be the hook by which all of these things you've been discussing can be hung on and bring groups together. And then kind of my question after all of that was having the National Academies report is nice, but then who takes the lead on implementing all of those recommendations? How's that going to happen? Is it going to be piecemeal again and just sort of a shotgun approach to try and accomplish these things without having a true priority list and an organizational process by which the public health laboratory community will work together? So I'm wondering what the next steps are, and maybe that's Ash's final conclusion on what next steps are, but would love to hear that.
So one of the, I share some of the frustration. I mean, it feels like One Health is just a collateral issue that we're supposed to deal with, but we're so busy doing our central core mission that we know it's out there, but none of us has that central core mission to do that. One area of success, though, that may be a model is the whole chemical and biological defense enterprise in the U.S. government. And I used to lead that within DOD. We worked very closely with ASPR. Gigi mentioned the FEMC was part of the model that was built to bring those entities together. And so I was over at the ASPR offices more than a couple times a month from my position at the Pentagon, and vice versa. So it was there. There was legislation in the National Defense Authorization Act that directed the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of HHS to do some of this together. That could be the model for this between, for example, USDA and HHS and whoever else needs to be involved. But there are models out there that have worked. It's just we got to get past that. So maybe that act could be that. And if we use the convening authority of the White House, especially with OMB and their unique ways of convening with the budget, then that could be a way to do that. But No, I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I thought your comment was very insightful and helpful. And I would say in the interim, because that's not going to happen overnight either, in the interim, there are things we can do. We can pull together a governance or steering committee that's made up of all the different critical partners, including manufacturers, which, were top of mind when we were setting up this meeting. And then to focus on specific areas, and again, taking that winnable battle concept. Where is it that we actually have a lot of capabilities, we have specimens coming in, where it's a couple of incremental steps can actually make a big difference, and that's the prioritization piece. But I think we can look at that early warning, ramp up of testing as two areas in particular where, we have an opportunity to make quick progress as we work on some of the longer term strategies that you're talking about. But thank you for that. All right, well, thank you very much to the panel. I really appreciate your comments today and also the really good discussion. And at this point, I would like to invite the Planning Committee Chair and the Forum Chairs back up for final comments.